We're going to start this episode of Speaking of Suicide with a poem. It comes from a collection called Brother by Sheila Lockhart, which, as the title suggests, was inspired by her brother, Simon, who took his own life. Just before we hear from Sheila, a reminder that Speaking of Suicide does cover some pretty difficult territory. If you need to, you can always press pause. You can also talk to Mikey's line, and I'll be giving out their details in a bit. Well, Sheila, let's hear the first poem that you've chosen. This is Reciting Betjeman. Why did you choose this one for us to kick off with?
Well, partly because it is an account of the last time I ever saw my brother alive, which was just a few weeks before he took his life. He was living in London and I'm up in the Highlands, so I didn't see him all that often. And I felt it was really important to get the sort of details right, because it was such a very strange meeting, and of course I didn't know at that point that it would be the last time I'd see him, and in retrospect it became hugely significant. I think it speaks for itself. My brother, well, we'll talk a bit more about him, won't we, anyway, but I'll just start off with this. Okay. Reciting Betjeman. The old ship's where I find you, having lunch, slumped in your corner seat beside the fire, a pint of best bitter and 2 sausage rolls set up before you on the beer-stained teak. Gastro grub, wild boar, not cheap, all I can eat these days, you say. You're looking rather thin and none too clean. I test the waters with some gentle talk, my trip abroad, your health, that sort of thing. You're staring at the lettuce on my plate and ask if you can finish what I've left. I'm really starved, you know, you say. Then, to my astonishment, recite from memory a poem by Betjeman, the one about the red electric train. A flash of former jauntiness, perhaps? Or was it a hint at how you'd end your pain? It's all changed these days, you say. I suggest a stroll, but you decline. I watch you bear your loneliness back home, shoulders sagging underneath its weight. Left with a helpless afternoon to pass, I find an empty seat on Richmond Green, feel the cold rain wet upon my face.
Now I find that even more poignant because I know Richmond Green and I know the area of the landscape that you're talking to us about. When you read that, are you back there with Simon?
Yes, in a way I am. I mean, I'm from that part of London as well, and I know it extremely well. And the old ship was the place he always went every day for his lunch, because he was quite reclusive and he was often very difficult to get hold of. And I was just passing through on my way back from a holiday in Italy, a few days in Italy, and I wanted to see him. He wasn't answering his phone, and I thought, if I go to the old ship at lunchtime, I'm sure to find him there, and I did. And yes, I've been back many times to Richmond because my mother was living there, and I still can't bring myself to go in the old ship. I can still see that corner table where he always sat, you know. Yeah, it does bring it back, yes, definitely.
So does the memory of Simon somehow be kept sharp by the fact that you put him in writing, that you put him on the page? Is it a way of keeping that memory?
For me, I don't know if it's a way of keeping the memory, because the memories are so clear in my mind. I mean, you know, it's a lifetime together, really. It was more a way of me trying to sort out what had happened in and deal with my own processing of grief and loss. But yeah, I mean, the memories will never go. I think even if I hadn't written it down, I'd still have the really vivid memories. And of course, all the family photographs, and you know, there's a lot of photographs in the house. Yeah.
We will come back to talk in detail about the grief and the loss.
Yes.
But tell me more about Simon.
Well, Simon died 8 years ago. Gosh, it's, you know, it doesn't seem that long, but each year goes by and I say, my God, was it really that long ago, you know? He was a very clever man, 4 years younger than me. He was 62 when he died. But from quite an early age, from his university days, he'd sort of shown signs of mental instability, which was eventually diagnosed as what they called in those days manic depression, but is now known as bipolar. And then it seemed to get worse. There were sort of symptoms of he had a number of psychotic episodes and numerous hospital admissions, and previous suicide attempts, one of which was really quite serious. But behind all that, he had this, he was very bright, he had this phenomenal memory and knowledge. That's why I was so amazed that he'd recited the poem, but in a way it didn't surprise me because it's the sort of thing he did, he would just come out with things like that. Yes, but he, in the later years, as I say, he lived on his own, and really lost contact with friends and became really quite reclusive. It was so sad to see him like that, yeah.
It can be really difficult, I think, to nurture and keep a relationship going when someone has problems like that, whether it's bipolar or whatever. Did he talk to you about his mental health? Did he talk to you about what he was going through?
No, one of the really big problems in the whole situation was that he didn't really have any insight. He knew that he was on medication all the time, which had various unpleasant side effects for him, and then he used to come off it, and then of course he would become either high or get very depressed, but he could never really accept that he needed to be on the medication. He couldn't make that connection, so... and he would never talk to his psychiatrist really about how he was feeling. I think if talking therapies had been offered to him much earlier on, they might have worked. But by then, he'd had this for 40-odd years, so it was almost too late. And that made it really difficult, because people wanted to help him, but... he sort of cut himself off from his friends and so on, yeah.
I was really struck by your line in that poem we heard, "I watch you bear your loneliness back home, yes. Shoulders sagging underneath its weight." It is so hard to watch someone you love struggle. How did you cope with watching him struggle?
Well, in a way, I was distanced from it, because I was living so far away. I didn't see him all that often. At that time, I was going down to Richmond maybe, 3 or 4 times a year, mainly to see my mother, and I didn't manage to see him every time I was down there. We had the occasional phone calls, but quite often they turned out to be very difficult. And, if he wasn't in a good state, he would be shouting at me down the phone. So I just sort of was up here and kind of out of it. But my mother, on the other hand, who lived just a mile or two away from him, phoned me every week, and she never talked about anything but him and her worries about him. So in that way, I was kept very close to the situation. I was a social worker, so I kind of would put my social work hat on and say to her, well, you need to contact his team if you're worried, or you need to do this, or speak to the support worker or whatever. And quite often I would then get involved and phone them myself and say, Mum hasn't heard from Simon for several weeks or whatever. So I couldn't do very much directly, but indirectly I was always trying to probably support Mum more than him, yeah, because it was hard for her, yeah.
Did you worry that you couldn't help?
Oh, yes.
Do more, or...
Of course, yes. Oh, yes, indeed I did. And, after he died, of course, that was... it still is, not as bad as it was, but this constant feeling that I should have done more. I shouldn't have just stepped away. I should have been there, phoned him more, made more attempts to maintain the relationship. But people said to me, I mean, his psychiatrist said to me, you know, it wouldn't have worked. It was his decision to kind of shut himself off from help, and it was such a serious condition that he had that, you know, ordinary kind of, well, I don't know. I mean, I still think I could have done more, but
I think that's human nature, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, even though he clearly struggled with mental health problems for, you know, most of his life, and you said he'd had serious previous attempts on taking his own life. In spite of that, how shocking was it to learn that he had completed suicide?
It was a total shock. I mean, you know, the psychiatrist, my mother and I went to see his consultant, probably about 10 years before he died. And she said at that point, you know, the prognosis is not good. And people, I think it was probably after his last attempt, you know, you have to prepare for yourself that one day he may succeed, he may do this, he's quite likely to do this again, and he may succeed. But when it happened, it was just a total shock. And I found out about it in very traumatic circumstances from a message left by a neighbour on my mobile while I was out hill walking. I mean, it was just horrendous. It was very traumatic.
I was thinking there, even though someone can say, prepare yourself, in practice, I mean, how can you?
You can't. I know. No.
I suppose we often can think of suicide as happening or being a course of action taken by a younger man. I wondered whether you ever felt his age was sort of a factor in maybe people's surprise, because what was he, 62 when he took his age? Was that a factor, I think, in how people responded to it, how people felt about it?
I think people who knew him weren't that surprised, because obviously he had problems for a long time, and there had been previous attempts. And I think people, you know, my friends who maybe didn't know him but knew me and were trying to support me, were very understanding. I don't think age in that sense. I mean, I know in terms of public perception now, it's an enormous problem among the young. And perhaps for older, you know, when older people take their lives, it's not talked about. I mean, it isn't so. In some ways, it's not so tragic, although it's tragic for those involved, obviously. But it's not as. I think it's not. No, I can't say it's not such a big social problem, or it's not so tragic when it's an older person, because it is. But for younger people, it's in a way worse, because it's the waste of a whole life, isn't it? A loss of a life, but. Everybody's different. It's so different for everyone, isn't it? In circumstances.
Yeah, I suppose when someone takes their life when they're younger, you can grieve for the life, the long life you wish they'd had, and that's slightly different maybe when the loss is someone who's older, but in a sense, with Simon, there was still the grief for the life he'd actually had, I suspect.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that was one of the saddest things, was that he'd had such a sad, lonely, wasted life in a way, considering he was very bright. I mean, he got it first, you know, at university and everything, and was promising career starting when he, you know, gave up work in his late 20s and never worked again. So yes, there was all that sadness and regret as well. Yeah.
So how much was it losing Simon that started you writing? What was the connection?
I did write a little bit before, but not in any sort of serious or, you know, ongoing way. What I did first, I think, was I wrote all the things that had happened, you know, I then had to sort of clear his flat, I had to support my mother, I had to arrange the funeral, I had to do all that kind of pretty much single-handed. I had a friend down in London who knew him well, and she helped as well. But I just wanted to write it all down because it was partly a way of getting the emotions out, but also I felt this is something so significant in my life. It's changed my life forever. It's the worst thing that's ever happened to me. I want to record it so that I remember in the future what happened, all the details. There were all, you know, lots of details. I mean, things like, you know, when my mother went to the funeral, we took her to the funeral, and it was only when we were sitting in the church and I realised she'd picked up her gloves from the box by the front door, and she'd put her gardening gloves on by mistake. You know, and she was sitting in the church with gardening gloves. I mean, it was just like details like that. I felt I have to get this down. So that started me writing, and then I started an Open University creative writing course, and part of that was to write. We had to write poetry and prose poetry, non-fiction, the whole range of stuff. And this poem I read at the beginning, reciting Betjeman, was done for that course. So it was one of the first things I wrote. And of course it very much related to the kind of stuff I was recording for my own benefit. And that kind of got me going, and I realised that poetry was what I wanted to write, and it just kept coming really after that. So, yeah.
And to what extent have you found that writing either through poetry or writing these detailed accounts of what happened, I mean, this helps you work through your relationship with Simon and what happened? What has it brought you?
That's a very difficult question to answer, actually. It was more I just felt I had to do it. And as I wrote more and more poems round about what had happened in our relationship and his life and my life, and I realised that because he was so much in my thoughts all the time, he was constantly there. Whatever I wrote, it would come out with some sort of reference to him. I mean, you know, we might be set a task. I mean, I've done lots of online poetry courses of writing some nature poem, but it would always turn out to be about Simon or about losing him or about loss in general. And I can't imagine how it would have been just to bottle all that up and not get it out on paper. Because obviously you can talk to people. I spent a lot of time talking to my husband. I have friends who are, you know, therapists and psychologists and have been very supportive and really helped me talk things through. But you can't keep on and on talking to people, you know, about your lost brother. I mean, there comes a point where you have to kind of just get on and deal with it yourself, really, and move on in life a bit. But it's always there, so yeah.
I suppose when we do talk about these things a lot, whether it's with friends or family or anyone else, I mean, or a therapist, the process is one of learning, of understanding or seeking understanding. I wondered whether you discovered anything or came to understand anything differently through writing him. That's another horrible question.
Yes, it is quite a hard one, that. I suppose it was a kind of acceptance eventually. I don't know if it would have happened even if I hadn't been writing, but it was sort of the process of just making sense of it all, exploring it all, sort of picking it apart, thinking, you know, that people talk a lot about the stages of grief and how they don't necessarily go in the kind of prescribed order, and sometimes I would feel really angry, and other times there'd be a sense of more of acceptance, often the guilt, you know, but yeah, I guess it just helped to keep going over and over it, but each time from perhaps a slightly different perspective, so that you get a more sort of kaleidoscopic almost view of what happened and your part in it. And
yeah. I mean, I asked the question because I write a bit as well, and I find that sometimes I can walk back over something through my mind or on the page and sort of discover things that I hadn't realised before I'd gone back over it on the page. That I can have insights where I think, I'm not sure I'd have come to that unless I'd written it.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Yes, there is something about you need to make sense of it all. I think there's a real human need to make sense of things, find meaning in things. Otherwise, it just becomes completely overwhelming. And I think the writing certainly helps sort of order things in a way. Or like I say, if you're writing about something completely different and then you read it and say, but actually that's not what that's about, it's about this, or it's about Simon, or it's about something else that's going on in your life,
It taps into deep stuff, doesn't it?
Yeah,
It comes out. We're going to hear another poem. This one you've chosen for us is called Melting Snow. Why did you choose to share this one?
Well, this is really about the process of writing, and I think in the early days, after you lose someone to suicide, and you are talking about it all the time to different people, and each time you talk about it, it's as if you're using the same pattern of words or sentences or expressions to tell, and it sort of develops its own narrative in a way, and that it becomes the story. So this poem is about that process, really, about how I started to use poetry, and not just the writing, but also the talking, to put things into a framework so that it becomes something that's outside yourself. So this is a story about my brother who committed suicide. It's not the overwhelming grief that sends me into floods of tears every 5 minutes that I just can't cope with and I'm going crazy about. So it sort of objectifies it a bit, if you like. But then every now and again, something comes flooding back, and you sort of then, clutch out at anything that you can to stop yourself going to pieces at that moment. So that's what this poem's about. It's called Melting Snow. Over time, I grow a narrative, irrigate and hoe, yielding harvests of familiar sentences, weaving a screen round the wasteland, word wall against the wilderness. One day in early spring, I glimpse a small bird foraging beneath the hedge, green shoots revealed by melting snow, and suddenly recall the day we cleared your flat, the poem neatly copied out, I have it still, about the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, though not in yours. And stumbling, I reach out for the wall, clutch at sentences to break my fall. So the poem that it refers to is obviously the poem by Emily Dickinson about hope is the thing with feathers, which is quite famous. But yes, that actually happened. I mean, we're looking out my window here at the bottom of that field, and there was a little bird, and I was just at the gate, and I just had to cling on to the gate. I was just, because suddenly this flashback came of that day in the flat, and finding the poem that a friend had written out for him, and he had it on a postcard. It was anyway.
I have to say the final line of that poem, and stumbling I reach for the wall, clutch at sentences to break my fall, I found so powerful and visual, and I could sort of see you collapsing with the weight of it. Has writing helped break the fall?
Oh yes, I would say so, definitely. Writing, but also, I mean, I had quite a bit of counselling as well. So I don't think the writing would have done it on its own. No, definitely not. I mean, I had so much support both from my husband and from, as I said before, from friends. But there were times when it just got really too much, and I did have counselling, and that also helped a lot. Yeah.
We'll come back, I think, to talk more about the counselling. I mean, suicide is by its very nature traumatic. How could it ever be anything but? So it seems a bit of an odd question, I suppose, to ask you how it impacted on you emotionally. But what was the effect? Because, as you said, it was deeply shocking.
Yeah, it was. Well, I mean, as most people will know, after a sort of sudden death, or that the first few weeks you're so busy organising things. I had my mother to look after, and then she ended up having to go into care. She was 94, about 6 months after that, and then I had to sell her house to pay for her care. So there was a lot going on, but all through that, I managed to hold it together because I'm quite a well-organised, practical person, just to do all that stuff. But I think the worst thing was this sense that you don't know who you are anymore. It's almost like you're working, you're acting as a kind of automaton. You do go through the motions of doing the stuff that has to be done, all the practical jobs. But my whole mental landscape, the way I saw myself, was just unrecognisable. I just had no idea who I was, and there was this sense of being on the edge of an abyss almost, like how am I ever going to function in the world again? Who am I? What's happening to me? I think that was probably the worst thing, and that I hadn't expected so much. I'd expected sadness and grief, but I hadn't expected that kind of sense of loss of self, really. Yeah.
We were talking before we met today, and you'd said that you wept every single day for 3 years.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Which just sounds, it's so desperately sad.
Yeah.
Yeah, really tough. Really tough. I mean, I know we all deal with grief differently. It's a very individual thing. How did your mum cope at her age with this?
Yeah, this was another very distressing thing for me, because she never really talked about it. She was of that generation where she'd lived through the war and everything, that you just got on with things. But because she was already in the early stages of dementia, and was actually drinking quite a lot, partly because of her own loneliness, but because she was very worried about him as well in the last few years, and was having falls and just not really coping in the house. She just never really. We could never really talk about it, and I mean, it was partly me. I couldn't talk about it, possibly, but she never really gave any openings, and I never saw her cry once. Never saw her cry. I mean, at first she'd say things like, "Oh, how could he do such a thing? I don't understand it. How could he do such a thing?" But later, after she went into care, and her dementia got worse, and I would go down and visit her, every month or so, and she would say to me, "I haven't seen Simon for ages. Why is he not coming to visit me? Have you seen him?" And like that, I would just choke up, and then I'd have to say, "Mum, no, I haven't seen him." And eventually I was able to say to her, "Well, Mum, Simon actually died." And she would say, "Oh, that's terrible. What happened?" And I'd just say, "Oh, he had a really bad accident. He had an accident." And she said, "Oh," and then she would just shut up and she wouldn't say anything. She'd sort of just lie there in her bed or sit there and just look a bit sort of distant. But she never really wanted to talk about it, so we couldn't share our grief at all.
And how difficult for you to have to, in a sense, go back round and round and round that loop of revealing again and again to your poor mum.
Yeah, it was
About the loss.
Was,
I mean, that must have been fantastically
it was
difficult.
horrible. Yeah, really awful.
We were talking a bit earlier about you as well as your own writing, there were other things that you reached for, counselling being one of them. But I wondered if, because writing and language is clearly special and precious to you, whether you reached for other people's writing and use of language too when you were grieving, and maybe still. Was there any particular writing that spoke to you?
I did, yes. I mean, especially sort of people who'd written about loss and grief. I mean, Thomas Hardy's poems from 1913 about the death of his wife I found very, very moving and helpful, because if you're reading that other people have been through the same sort of feelings, have had that same sense of shock and sudden loss, and were able to write about it, I think it does help. I mean, it's like you're not alone, you're not alone in this. And sometimes these poems are heartbreaking, but they do help. They're kind of consolation, really, I think, knowing that other people have been able to make something of their loss. And
I guess it's not, I mean, that made me think that actually, in part, it's about what we're doing with this podcast series with Speaking of Suicide. It's just a sharing of experience, of stories, and that doesn't matter whether it's written down. We're just doing it here in a different form, but it's about being able to put something there which hopefully someone listening to this will make them feel less alone in their own story, in their own grief, whatever that shape that takes. So I guess it doesn't matter whether it's a poem or...
Well, I really hope it does, because, I think everybody says, and it's absolutely true, that bereavement by suicide is completely different from any other kind of bereavement. And I don't think you ever get over it. And I think it's quite hard for people who haven't had that experience to understand that. They think it's like, losing a parent, or... I mean, I'm sure losing a child must be the same sort of thing, but again, the suicide element of it has that sort of also that sense of guilt and failure and so on. So I think to know that other people have been through the same thing or are going through it, I hope makes it a little bit easier when you think, well, nobody else can possibly know what this feels like, because people who've been through it do know what it feels like. Although, of course, it's different for everyone, but yeah. And I mean, when you say, I did cry every day for 3 years, I'm a bit of a weepy sort of person, and actually it's made me much worse. I now cry at almost anything. It doesn't take much to set me off. It was like, I found my crying trigger.
Well, I don't think that's a bad thing.
It can be a bit embarrassing sometimes.
I always think a good cry is not a bad thing. It's showing emotion. It's getting it out there, and I feel very sad for your mum that she wasn't able to cry, and maybe you were crying
well,
tears
maybe
for
she
both
cried
of you.
on her own. I don't know, but
We are going to have one more poem from you. This is Summer Solstice. Let's hear it, and then you can explain more about it.
Summer solstice. Summer slides a knife between the curtains, creeps across the carpet, inserts its point between my eyelids, prizing them apart, like shucked oysters to steal winter's pearl. I step out onto the patio, bare feet on smooth slate, sky huge and pale, underbellied with gold. Down in the village a single cockerel crows. I listen to sunrise as grief grows cold. It's not true what they say about the shadow of death. I've walked that particular glen in summer sunshine so bright every blade of grass glittered, every horizon cut like a knife. No, it's not the darkness I fear, but the sun's blinding light.
Tell us about that poem.
Yes. Well, my brother died in the summer, and we found out just shortly before my birthday, and his birthday was always what was 3 days after mine. So for me now, that kind of point of June, in midsummer in June, is forever kind of tainted. You know, it used to be such a happy, joyful time, and I do love summer, but it always brings back these memories now. So it's kind of, you know, been spoiled in a way. And the first year after he died, and I'd had all this to deal with my mum going into care and everything, and my husband was actually working away from home, so I was on my own at home quite a bit, like for a week at a time, and I just really wasn't coping. I think I hadn't really anticipated that an anniversary could be so hard, and I was sleeping very badly, and I was getting up, you know, at 4 o'clock in the morning and just going and standing in the garden and feeling that sort of peace, and then feeling absolutely desperate and not knowing what on earth to do. How would I cope? And feeling quite at risk myself. You know, I just felt I couldn't go on, really. I couldn't see that it was ever going to get any easier or any better. It was just seemed to be getting worse, actually. So yes, I mean, I certainly had kind of suicidal thoughts myself at that time. And that was when I sort of first... I went to the doctor, actually, and I didn't want to take tablets. You know, I've never been a great one for tablets. And the doctor said, well, why don't you try some counselling? Of course, they couldn't do it on the National Health, but she said there are people, you know, online that I can recommend. Anyway, I did find somebody quite nearby who I went to see several times, which really helped at that point to give me kind of faith in myself again. So yes, that's what the poem was about, really. That, you know, people think of death and grief in dark terms. You know, it's you know, valley of the shadow of death. But actually, for me, it's the summer that's the difficult time, when everything's so exposed by the light in a way that you can't escape. There's nowhere to escape from.
And where you live in a beautiful part of the Highlands, I mean, the thing about the living up here so far north as we both do is the summers are very light and very bright, and there's no escaping the seasons here. At any time of year, you're very conscious of the seasons. And so as you read that, and I was looking out of the window, and I thought, oh my goodness, you're always going to be very aware here of that light.
Yes, absolutely.
Creeping in. And ongoing, how do you find the resilience to hold that grief in check? Because you were saying that, you know, I don't suppose you can ever stop grieving in some ways from a loss through suicide. So are there things day to day or week to week or season to season that you do?
I think life, you know, I think the human mind is naturally resilient for most people, especially if you've got good support. I mean, I think that's absolutely vital. And gradually, it's just a gradual process that, you know, each year I would say to myself, my goodness, you know, it's 5 years, it's 6 years, and I'm still feeling terrible. But after 7 years, I feel, well, I'm not feeling so bad, you know. I'm doing stuff, I'm going out, I got my pamphlet published. There are things that I can enjoy in life that kind of then, you know, take over. And I think the mind heals itself if you give it time. It just has to take its own time, and its own process, yeah. But, you know, there are still, I mean, I lost my mum last year, so that was also, you know, much more expected. She was over 100, but kind of brought back a lot of stuff and a lot of sadness and feeling that, you know, well, I haven't actually got any family left now. That's been difficult, but you know, it is life. I mean, life is full of loss, and I think that's why people need each other, need writing, literature, poetry. It's all stuff that helps you get through this business of life. Nature is very important. I love gardening. I love walking out in the woods and on the hills, and that really helps too, yeah.
As you said, you've had your collection of poems, Brother, recently published. How does that feel to have this work about Simon now out there and public? And
very, very strange. I mean, I certainly went through phases of actually regretting having ever done it. I mean, originally, I think as I was working on the poems, putting them together, I was thinking, I'm doing this for him, you know, as a memorial for him. But then, I mean, it was published last November 2023, and, you know, I had to then start reading the poems in public, and suddenly it all felt rather exposed. And then I felt odd about, you know, exposing him, as it were. You know, we've talked a lot about him, and was that the right thing to do? And I can't imagine what he would have thought about all of that, or even what my mother would have thought, because, you know, by the time this happened, she was too profoundly demented to really understand any of it. And I wouldn't have brought it up anyway, because, you know, talking about him would, I think, have been very difficult for her and for me. So yes, it's been quite odd. Yeah, and quite nerve-wracking. But and it's almost now as if I want to kind of put it behind me and forget about it and start moving on and writing new stuff, which isn't about all this that happened. That this is about the future and about, you know, other things in my life. There has to be more to my life than the loss of my brother, obviously. I'm glad I did it. It's felt like an achievement, and it's been well received. People have said, you know, really kind things about it, which has been fantastic. And I do know, you know, people who've said it's really helped them and helped people that they knew. So that's been nice to hear as well. Yeah.
Well, Simon liked his poetry, so I suspect he'd have been very proud of you, but who knows? I hope he would, because I have to say, I think your poetry collection, Brother, is beautiful. It's a beautiful way of remembering him. I found it hugely touching going through the poems. Honestly, I found it so moving, very special.
Thank you.
Thank you for being brave enough to get in touch and tell me about it, and to share it with us for Speaking of Suicide. I really appreciate it, Sheila.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. Thank you.
I was talking to Sheila Lockhart about her poetry book, Brother, which is published by V Press. A reminder, if you need someone to talk to, you can text Mikey's line on 07786 20 77 55, or contact them via Messenger, web chat or Twitter. And the number for WhatsApp is 01463 729 000. They're open Sunday to Thursday 6 p.m. to 10 p.m, Friday to Saturday 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Shona McPherson from Mikey's Line has been listening to Sheila. Here's her takeaway thoughts.
I was so struck by Sheila's articulation of her grief, the depth and the endurance of the pain that she suffered. And I've just taken a couple of lines that I thought are worth repeating about how she experiences that sense of loss of self. She says, a sense that you don't know who you are anymore. You're acting like an automaton, going through the motions of doing what needs to be done, but within a mental landscape that's unrecognisable, being on the edge of abyss. And I think this can be true for us if we've lost someone to suicide, and it can be true of us if we are feeling suicidal. And I think there can be a real sense of connection in hearing someone's words like Sheila voicing what we feel. A couple of other things that I just pulled out from listening to Sheila there. The importance not to assume just because a family member has been ill for a long time, like Simon was, not to assume that we're going to feel the grief any less. Even if we have a forewarning, it still can hit us so strongly. Struck by her mother's inability to talk about her pain or her grief, not as a criticism of her mother, but just to notice how difficult it can be for others and how difficult that must be for us if we're trying to support someone who can't speak. And noticing that Simon did have many risk factors. He was an older gentleman with mental illness that he lived with for a long time, crippling mental illness. And that doesn't mean that suicide is inevitable. So if you are older or are struggling with mental health, that far from means that it's inevitable for you. And if you are struggling from bereavement of suicide or from feeling suicidal yourself, just encourage you, as Sheila did, to find a way to get a support that works for you. Sheila found counselling helped her. She found that writing worked for her or helped her. So I want to close with her words: stumbling, I reach for the wall, writing to help break the fall.
Shona McPherson. Speaking of Suicide was started by family firm D&D Paving Limited in collaboration with and in support of Mikey's Line. The series is funded by Mikey's Line and the platform by D&D Paving Limited. Speaking of Suicide is produced by Adventurous Audio Limited.